An injured hunter faces a tiger in the wild, but the tiger's next move surprises even the bravest witnesses. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The crack of a rifle pierced the dawn silence. Jake watched as his father lowered the weapon, satisfaction etched across his weathered face. The deer collapsed 30 yards ahead, its legs giving out in a final, graceless descent. Steam rose from its body in the crisp morning air. "That's how it's done, son," Robert Marshall said, his voice carrying the same mechanical precision as a shot. "Clean. Quick. No hesitación." He gestured for Jake to approach the fallen animal. Jake, 12 years old and dressed in camouflage that matched his father's, stepped forward. His boots crunched on frozen leaves. The deer's eyes were still open, glazed over, but somehow accusing. Jake felt his stomach tighten. "Check for vital signs," Robert commanded. "Make sure the job's finished." Jake knelt beside the deer, his hand trembling as he reached for its neck. The fur was still warm. "No pulse." He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping it on his pants, though there was no blood. "Speak up, boy. Is it done?" "Yes, sir. It's dead." Robert nodded, the closest thing to approval Jake would receive today. "Remember, son, nature isn't your friend. Out here, it's kill or be killed. Sentiment gets you nowhere." The scene shifted in Jake's mind, blending into countless other memories of similar mornings. He remembered standing in their backyard at age 8, his father setting up paper targets on hay bales. The rifle felt enormous in his small hands, its weight a constant reminder of responsibility. "Focus, Jake." His father's voice cut through the memory. "You're drifting again. That's how you miss. That's how you die." The paper targets showed scattered holes, none in the center. "Again, until you get it right." Hours stretched into years. Jake learned to steady his hands, to control his breathing, to silence the voice inside that questioned each pull of the trigger. The paper targets became real animals. His father's approval remained elusive, measured in short nods and brief moments of silence rather than words of encouragement. Now, at 32, Jake walked the same forest paths alone. His rifle, a gift from his father on his 18th birthday, felt different in his hands. Each step brought familiar sensations. The crunch of leaves, the whisper of wind through branches, the occasional snap of a twig that could signal prey. But something had changed. Jake found himself pausing more often, watching animals instead of immediately lining up shots. He noticed details his father would have dismissed as irrelevant. The way deer moved as a family unit, how wolves coordinated their hunts, the complex social behaviors of various species. These moments of observation brought questions he'd never dared to voice in his father's presence. What separated survival from sport? Where was the line between respect for nature and dominion over it? His father's words echoed in his mind. Nature isn't your friend. But was it necessarily an enemy? Standing in a clearing, Jake lowered his rifle. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. A doe and her fawn crossed his path 50 yards ahead. Perfect shot, clear line of sight, all the conditions his father had drilled into him. Instead of raising his weapon, Jake watched them pass. The doe's ears twitched, sensing his presence, but something in his stillness must have reassured her. The fawn stumbled slightly, regained its footing, and followed its mother into the undergrowth. For the first time, Jake felt something his father had never taught him. Doubt. Not about his ability to take the shot, but about whether he should. This doubt wasn't weakness, as his father would have claimed. It felt more like the beginning of wisdom, a crack in the foundation of everything he'd been taught about his relationship with the natural world. The weight of his rifle, once a source of pride and connection to his father's legacy, now felt like a burden. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something significant, a transformation that would challenge everything he'd been raised to believe. Pain shot through Jake's leg as consciousness returned. The last thing he remembered was the steep ravine, his foot catching on an exposed root, and the sickening sensation of falling. Now, lying on his back, he stared up at a canopy of leaves that seemed to spin above him. His rifle was nowhere in sight. A distant rumble of thunder made him flinch. No, not thunder. A growl. Jake's training kicked in as adrenaline flooded his system. He attempted to sit up, but sharp pain in his ribs forced him back down. His hunting knife remained strapped to his belt, but against what he suspected was coming, it might as well have been a toothpick. The undergrowth rustled 20 yards away. Jake held his breath, fighting against rising panic. Through the gaps in the foliage, he caught glimpses of orange and black stripes. A tiger. Here, in these woods where no tiger should be. The creature emerged fully into view, and Jake's worst fears were confirmed. The tiger was massive, easily 10 feet from nose to tail. Muscles rippled beneath its striped coat with each silent step. A fresh wound marked its shoulder, still seeping blood. Evidence that Jake wasn't the only injured party in these woods. Their eyes met, and Jake felt the weight of his father's teachings dissolve into uselessness. No amount of training had prepared him for this. "So this is how it ends," Jake whispered, his voice surprisingly steady. He gripped his knife, knowing it was futile but unwilling to die without resistance. The tiger, whom he would later name Blaze, tilted its head at the sound of his voice. The gesture was almost curious, disturbingly intelligent. Jake expected the tiger to charge. Instead, it lowered its head and sniffed the air, taking cautious steps forward. Its movement revealed a pronounced limp, favoring its injured shoulder. Despite his situation, Jake found himself assessing the wound professionally. Gunshot, probably. Someone else had encountered this magnificent creature and tried to kill it. The distance between them closed. 10 yards. 5. 3. Jake's knife hand trembled. The tiger's breath was visible in the cool air, its eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that seemed to peer into his soul. At 2 yards, Jake closed his eyes, waiting for the killing blow. It never came. Instead, he felt hot breath on his face, followed by a gentle nudge against his shoulder. Jake's eyes snapped open. The tiger stood over him, but its posture wasn't aggressive. If anything, it appeared concerned, an emotion Jake would have sworn impossible in a wild predator. What happened next defied everything Jake knew about wildlife. The tiger gripped Jake's jacket carefully between its teeth and began to drag him, mindful of his injuries. The pain in his ribs flared, but Jake remained still, instinctively understanding that movement might break whatever strange spell had fallen over this encounter. They traveled roughly 50 yards through the forest, the tiger occasionally stopping to check their surroundings. Jake noticed they were following a subtle game trail, one that led to a cave entrance partially hidden by fallen logs. The tiger pulled him inside, where the temperature was notably warmer. The cave floor was lined with dry leaves and grass, a den. Jake's hunting experience told him this was the tiger's sanctuary, yet here he was, being brought into it like a cub rather than prey. The absurdity of the situation struck him, and a laugh escaped his lips, immediately followed by a groan of pain. Blaze settled nearby, positioning himself between Jake and the cave entrance. The message was clear. Jake wasn't dinner, but he also wasn't free to leave. As darkness fell outside, the temperature dropped, and Jake found himself grateful for the tiger's body heat. Through the night, every time Jake stirred or groaned in pain, Blaze would raise his head, checking on him. The behavior was so far removed from everything Jake had been taught about predators that he began to question the very foundation of his understanding of wildlife. By morning, Jake's injuries had stiffened, but he was alive, saved by the very creature his upbringing had taught him to fear and dominate. As sunlight crept into the cave, Blaze rose and disappeared briefly, returning with a dead rabbit. The tiger dropped it near Jake, then retreated to his watching position. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. He had entered these woods as a hunter and ended up being cared for by what should have been his most dangerous adversary. In the tiger's eyes, he saw not the mindless killer his father had warned him about, but an intelligence and compassion that would forever change his perspective on the natural world. The Rusty Buck Bar fell silent as Jake finished his story. The usual Friday night crowd, a mix of hunters, loggers, and locals, stared at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright hostility. The only sound came from the old ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead and the clink of ice in whiskey glasses. You expect us to believe a tiger saved your life? Tom Davidson, a veteran hunter who'd known Jake since childhood, broke the silence. Come on, your daddy would roll in his grave hearing you spout this nonsense. Jake traced the rim of his glass with his finger. His ribs still ached, a constant reminder that everything he described was real. I don't expect anything, Tom. I'm just telling you what happened. A tiger. Bill Matthews scoffed from his corner table. Next thing you'll tell us is you're giving up hunting to become a tree hugger. Several hunters laughed, but the sound was uneasy. Sarah Chun, the local veterinarian, pushed away from the bar and approached Jake's table. Actually, there have been reports of a tiger in these woods for months. Most people dismiss them as mountain lion sightings, but she was cut off by another hunter's dismissive wave. Don't encourage him, Sarah. Man hits his head, gets confused, and now he's spreading stories about some magical tiger playing nurse. The speaker, Mike Reynolds, was one of Jake's father's old hunting buddies. I saw the wound on his shoulder, Jake continued, his voice steady. Someone shot him. He was hurt, just like me, but he still chose to help rather than attack. The bar erupted into heated discussions. One group, led by Sarah and a few younger residents, gathered around Jake's table, eager to hear more details. The other group, primarily older hunters, clustered near the bar, their expressions dark with disapproval. You're talking about apex predators like their house cats, Mike called out. That kind of thinking gets people killed. Your father taught you better than that. The mention of his father stung, but Jake held his ground. My father taught me that nature was our enemy, that it was kill or be killed. But what I experienced in that cave... In that cave, you were delirious, Tom interrupted. Hit your head in the fall and started seeing things. Simple as that. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Jake photos from her trail cameras. These were taken 2 weeks ago. The images are blurry, but that's definitely not a mountain lion. The photos showed a large, striped figure moving through the underbrush at night. The bar's atmosphere grew more tense as word spread through the small town. By closing time, clear battle lines had been drawn. The conservation group, which had struggled for years to gain traction in the community, suddenly found itself with an unlikely ally in Jake Marshall, son of the town's most renowned hunter. Over the next few days, Jake's story traveled beyond the bar. Local news outlets picked up the tale, drawing attention from neighboring communities. Wildlife enthusiasts began arriving, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious tiger. Hunters complained about outsiders disturbing their traditional grounds. The division deepened when Jake declined to lead a hunting party to track the tiger. He's not a threat, Jake insisted during a heated town meeting. If he wanted to hurt people, he would have killed me in that cave. His oldest friend, Marcus Cooper, confronted him outside the town hall. What happened to you out there, Jake? Really? Marcus's eyes searched his face. We've been hunting together since we were kids. Now you're siding with these conservation nuts? I'm not siding with anyone, Jake replied. I'm just telling the truth about what happened. That tiger showed more mercy than most humans I know. The statement spread through the town like wildfire, drawing both praise and condemnation. Environmental groups reached out to Jake, seeking his support for new conservation initiatives. Hunting supply stores that had once welcomed him now displayed no trespassing signs when they saw him approach. The final straw came when Jake publicly opposed the upcoming hunting season's expanded permits. Standing before the town council, he argued for protected status for the local wildlife, especially in areas where the tiger had been spotted. You're not just betraying your father's memory, an old family friend told him afterward. You're betraying this whole community. These woods have fed our families for generations. But Jake noticed something else happening beneath the surface of these confrontations. Younger residents, many of whom had accepted hunting as an unquestionable tradition, began to express doubts. They asked questions their parents had never considered, sparked by the story of a hunter and a tiger who defied natural law to help each other. The community's foundation, built on generations of established beliefs about humanity's relationship with nature, had begun to crack. And Jake, once a pillar of that traditional worldview, found himself standing in the widening gap, watching as his simple story of survival transformed into a catalyst for change that nobody had seen coming. The local chapter of Wildlife Conservation Alliance had never seen their meeting room so packed. Every folding chair was occupied, with people standing along the walls. At the podium, Jake adjusted the microphone, acutely aware that half the faces in the crowd belonged to people who, just months ago, would have considered him a trusted hunting companion. "My father taught me that strength meant domination," Jake began, his voice steady despite his nerves. He was wrong. Real strength, I learned, is choosing not to harm when you have every reason to do so. The projector behind him displayed the photo Sarah had captured ablaze on her trail camera. This tiger had every natural instinct telling him to see me as prey. Instead, he showed compassion. If a wild animal can choose mercy over violence, what does that say about us? A murmur ran through the crowd. Jake noticed several of his former hunting partners shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But he also saw younger faces leaning forward, engaged and curious. After the presentation, Maria Rodriguez, the Alliance's regional director, approached him. "We need more voices like yours, Jake. People trust you. You're not some outsider telling them what to do. You're one of them." Jake nodded, already formulating plans. "We need to change the conversation. It's not about banning hunting entirely. It's about understanding our role in the ecosystem." Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into his new mission. He organized educational programs at local schools, teaching children about wildlife behavior and conservation. The same skills that had made him an excellent hunter, understanding animal patterns, reading tracks, interpreting behavior, now served a different purpose. His first community event, Living with Wildlife, drew unexpected attention. He set up interactive stations showing how to identify animal tracks, understand territorial markings, and recognize signs of wildlife in distress. The turnout surprised everyone, not just environmental enthusiasts, but curious locals who'd never considered conservation before. The backlash was swift and fierce. Someone painted "traitor" across his truck one night. Anonymous calls warned him to remember his place. The local hunting supply store, where he'd worked part-time during high school, posted his picture behind the counter with a note, "Do not serve." But for every act of hostility, there was an unexpected ally. Sarah Chin volunteered her veterinary expertise for his educational programs. Marcus Cooper, after initial resistance, began asking thoughtful questions about sustainable hunting practices. Even some older hunters, though they wouldn't admit it publicly, sought him out privately to discuss finding middle ground. Jake's most ambitious project was establishing a wildlife corridor through traditional hunting grounds. The proposal sparked immediate controversy. At the town hall meeting, he faced angry accusations from his father's old friends. "You're destroying our way of life," shouted Mike Reynolds, red-faced with anger. "These woods have fed our families for generations." Jake remained calm, drawing on the patience he'd learned from his encounter with Blaze. "We're not closing the woods. We're ensuring there will be wildlife for future generations. Even hunters should want sustainable populations." The meeting descended into chaos when someone suggested Jake's accident had scrambled his brain. But through the shouting, Jake noticed something important. The younger generation was largely on his side. They understood that preservation didn't mean elimination of traditional practices. It meant evolution. Late one evening, while developing materials for his next educational program, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Old Tom Davidson, one of his father's closest friends, stood awkwardly in his doorway. "Your daddy would have hated all this," Tom said finally. "But," he paused, struggling with the words, "he also taught us that a man stands by what he believes. You're doing that even if we don't agree with it." The comment struck Jake deeply. He'd been prepared for continued hostility, but this grudging respect meant more than outright support from conservation allies. His educational initiatives began showing results. Trail camera footage revealed increasing wildlife activity in protected areas. Reports of conflict between humans and animals decreased as people learned to better understand and respect wildlife patterns. Even some hardcore hunters started incorporating conservation principles into their practices. Jake's daily routine transformed completely. Instead of planning hunting trips, He coordinated with wildlife photographers to document animal behavior. Rather than teaching tracking for hunting, he taught it for observation and research. His gun cabinet gathered dust while his camera equipment multiplied. The threats continued, but they became background noise to the growing support. Local businesses, seeing the potential for ecotourism, began cautiously backing his initiatives. The school board approved an environmental education program based on his curriculum. Most significantly, Jake noticed a subtle shift in how the community viewed wildlife. What had once been seen simply as game or threats were increasingly recognized as integral parts of a complex ecosystem. The change wasn't universal or complete, but it was tangible. 1 year after his encounter with Blaze, Jake stood before another packed meeting room. This time, he was presenting evidence of increased wildlife diversity in the protected corridors. The data spoke for itself. Conservation wasn't just protecting animals, it was enriching the entire ecosystem, including the human community that depended on it. We don't have to choose between tradition and conservation, he concluded. We can honor our past while building a better future. That's the real lesson Blaze taught me in that cave. The applause wasn't unanimous, but it was genuine. Jake had found his new mission, and more importantly, he'd found a way to bridge the gap between two worlds that had seemed irreconcilable. Dawn painted the forest in shades of gold as Jake shouldered his new equipment. The weight of his camera gear felt foreign compared to his old rifle, but somehow more right. He checked his GPS coordinates one last time, marking the location where he'd fallen that fateful day. This time, he wasn't hunting. He was searching for understanding. The morning dew soaked his boots as he moved silently through the underbrush. Old habits serving new purposes. Every sound, every snapped twig and rustling leaf sent his pulse racing, not from the hunter's anticipation he once knew, but from the possibility of encountering Blaze again. "You're being reckless," Sarah had warned him the night before. "That tiger might have helped you once, but he's still wild." Jake had nodded, acknowledging her concern while knowing he had to do this. Some answers could only be found in the heart of the forest. The ravine where he'd fallen came into view. Jake paused, memories flooding back. The pain, the fear, the certainty of death, and then the impossible kindness of a predator. He set up his first camera trap, carefully positioning it to capture any movement along the game trail. As he worked deeper into the forest, signs of Blaze's presence became evident. Fresh claw marks on trees, about 8 feet high, territorial markings. Jake photographed each one, noting their location and frequency. The marks told a story. This was more than just a transient tiger's territory. Blaze had made these woods his home. Near a small stream, Jake found distinctive paw prints in the mud. He knelt beside them, measuring their size with his hand. They were fresh, no more than a few hours old. His heart rate quickened. Somewhere in these woods, Blaze was watching, perhaps even now. The cave where he'd spent that transformative night appeared different in daylight. Smaller somehow, yet no less significant. Jake approached cautiously, respecting it as both shelter and sanctuary. Inside, he found evidence of recent occupation, fresh bedding of leaves, scattered bones from meals, the lingering scent of predator. Setting up his last camera trap near the cave entrance, Jake's hands trembled slightly. He wasn't afraid, exactly. The emotion was more complex, a mixture of anticipation, respect, and something approaching reverence. The forest had ceased to be merely a hunting ground. It had become a temple of sorts, where life and death played out in an ancient, sacred dance. Hours passed as Jake documented the area. His photographer's eye caught details his hunter's gaze had missed. The way sunlight filtered through leaves creating natural spotlights, the intricate patterns of moss on tree trunks, the delicate balance of life evident in every square foot of forest floor. A sudden silence fell over the woods, the kind of silence that speaks volumes to those who know how to listen. Birds stopped singing. Small creatures froze in place. Jake's muscles tensed, remembering this silence from countless hunting trips. But now, instead of reaching for a weapon, he reached for his camera. Movement caught his eye, a flash of orange and black through the trees. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Through his camera's viewfinder, he saw him, Blaze, moving with fluid grace through his domain. The wound on his shoulder had healed, leaving a visible scar that somehow made him more magnificent. The tiger paused, lifting his head to scent the air. Jake remained absolutely still, Fing. Hovering over the shutterbutton. Their eyes met across the clearing, and in that moment, Jake felt the last vestiges of his old self fall away. There was no fear, no desire to dominate or control. Only awe. Blaze held his gaze for what felt like eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, with deliberate slowness, the tiger lowered himself to the forest floor. Not in a hunting crouch, but in a pose that seemed almost relaxed. Jake barely dared to breathe. The camera's quiet click broke the spell. Blaze's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Instead, he yawned, showing impressive fangs in what seemed almost like a display of casual indifference. Jake couldn't help but smile. The apex predator was letting himself be photographed, as if posing for a portrait. As the sun began to set, Jake prepared to leave, gathering his equipment with reverent care. Blaze had disappeared into the growing shadows hours ago, but his presence lingered in the air like a benediction. The photos in Jake's camera were more than just images. They were proof of something profound, that the line between predator and prey, between wild and tame, was far more complex than humanity had imagined. Walking back through the darkening forest, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. He had entered these woods seeking answers and found something more valuable, a new way of seeing. The forest was neither friend nor enemy, neither resource nor adversary. It was simply home to Blaze, to countless other creatures, and in a way Jake was only now beginning to understand, to humans as well. His phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends, wondering if he was safe. Jake smiled, composing a simple response, "I'm fine. We all are." He knew they wouldn't understand, not yet. But the photos would help tell the story, and maybe, just maybe, help others see what he now saw so clearly, that the greatest strength lies not in domination, but in coexistence. The morning light filtered through the canopy as Jake set up his equipment for what had become a weekly ritual. His camera bag now contained not just photography gear, but also a small medical kit. Sarah's insistence after she'd seen evidence of minor injuries on Blaze in Jake's photos. "If you're going to be the world's first tiger whisperer," she'd said, half joking, "at least be prepared to help if he's hurt." Jake checked the footage from his trail cameras before settling into his usual spot near the cave. Over the past weeks, he'd documented Blaze's patterns, learning that the tiger often returned to this area during early morning hours. The data he'd collected was invaluable for research, but it was the personal moments that truly mattered. "You know," Jake spoke softly into the morning air, "a year ago, I would have called anyone crazy for talking to a tiger." He'd started these one-sided conversations weeks ago, partly to help Blaze recognize his voice, partly because the silence needed filling. "I owe you more than I can explain." A rustle in the undergrowth made him pause. Blaze emerged from the forest, moving with a fluid grace that still took Jake's breath away. The tiger shoulder scar had healed completely, but Jake noticed a slight limp in his back right leg. Something new. "You've been in a fight," Jake murmured, raising his camera. The photos would help Sarah assess the injury severity. Blaze approached with measured steps, showing none of the wariness that had marked their early encounters. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like recognition in his amber eyes. The tiger settled about 15 feet away, close enough for detailed observation, but maintaining a respectful distance. Jake had learned to read Blaze's body language. The relaxed shoulders, the slow blinks, the way his tail rested quietly rather than twitching with tension. These were signs of trust, hard-won over months of patient interaction. "Let me look at that leg," Jake said, keeping his voice steady and calm. He moved, slowly, telegraphing each motion as he'd learned to do. Blaze watched him with what Jake could only describe as tolerant amusement, like a teacher observing a well-meaning but overcautious student. The distance between them closed to 10 feet, then 8. Jake could hear Blaze's breathing now, deep and regular. He pulled out his phone, recording video for Sarah's analysis. The leg injury didn't appear serious, probably from a territorial dispute with another large predator. But it was better to be certain. Blaze shifted position, turning to give Jake a better view of his injured leg. The movement was so deliberate it stopped Jake mid-motion. "You're showing me," he realized aloud. "You actually want me to see it." The intelligence in those eyes seemed to confirm his observation. Their routine had evolved over time. Jake would arrive early, set up his equipment, and wait. Blaze would appear when he chose, sometimes immediately, sometimes after hours. They would share space, neither encroaching too far into the other's comfort zone, but always aware of each other. Today was different. Blaze rose suddenly, moving closer than he ever had before. Jake's heart raced, but he held his ground. The tiger's whiskers were close enough to count his breath warm on Jake's face. Then, in a gesture that defied every natural law Jake had ever learned, Blaze pressed his forehead against Jake's shoulder. The contact lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Jake remained perfectly still, tears forming in his eyes. This wasn't just trust, it was acceptance. Communication. A bridge across species that shouldn't have been possible. When Blaze pulled back, Jake released the breath he'd been holding. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words felt inadequate. The tiger blinked slowly at him before settling down nearby, closer than ever before. Jake began his usual documentation, photographs, notes, observations, but his hands shook slightly. What had just happened transcended scientific observation. It was a moment of connection that would have seemed impossible in his previous life as a hunter. As the morning wore on, Jake noticed something else. Blaze wasn't just tolerating his presence. He was actively engaging with it. When Jake moved to check his camera traps, the tiger followed at a distance, watching the process with apparent interest. When Jake sat to review his photos, Blaze positioned himself to keep both Jake and the forest entrance in view. Protective behavior that Sarah would later describe as unprecedented. "You've adopted me, haven't you?" Jake asked, amused and moved by the realization. Blaze's ear flicked in his direction, acknowledging his voice. A tiger choosing to protect a human. Dad would never have believed it. The light was fading when Jake finally packed his equipment. Blaze had dozed off nearby, but opened his eyes as Jake stood. Their gazes met one final time, and Jake saw in those amber depths not just intelligence, but something approaching wisdom. "I'll be back next week," Jake promised, though he suspected Blaze already knew his schedule better than he did. The tiger watched him leave, maintaining his guardianship until Jake was safely out of sight. Walking back through the darkening forest, Jake reflected on how far they'd both come. A hunter and a predator, natural enemies by all accounts, had forged something unprecedented. Their connection wasn't just about trust or mutual respect. It was about possibility. The possibility that humans and wildlife could find ways to coexist that no one had imagined before. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "How's our patient?" Jake smiled, scrolling through the day's photos to send her the best ones. He paused at an image that captured Blaze mid-blink, looking directly at the camera with an expression of almost human understanding. "More than a patient," Jake typed back. "He's teaching us more than we could ever teach him." He attached the photos, they would add to the growing body of evidence that animals were far more complex, far more capable of connection than humanity had ever given them credit for. The emergency town meeting was called on a stormy Tuesday evening after 3 hunters claimed they'd spotted Blaze stalking their hunting blinds. The community center buzzed with tension as residents filed in, clearly divided. Hunters on one side, conservationists on the other, with an uncomfortable void in between. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, his weathered face grave. "We've got reports of the tiger approaching hunting areas. Some folks are demanding immediate action." His eyes found Jake in the crowd. Others insist the animal isn't dangerous. "We need to address this before someone gets hurt, human or animal." Mike Reynolds stood up, his hunting jacket still muddy from the field. "That beast was less than 50 yards from my position yesterday. What happens when it decides to attack? Are we waiting for a tragedy?" "Blaze has been here for over a year," Jake countered, rising from his seat. "Not a single incident of aggression toward humans. He's actually avoiding confrontation. Blaze? Mike spat the name like a curse. You named it? That thing is a predator, not a pet. Your father would be. My father isn't here. Jake cut in, his voice sharp. And this isn't about him. It's about facts. I have documented evidence of Blaze's behavior patterns. He's not hunting humans. He's protecting his territory. Sarah Chin stepped forward, laptop in hand. I've analyzed Jake's data. The tiger's movements show clear avoidance of populated areas. When he approaches hunting blinds, it's because they're placed in his established territory. The meeting erupted into shouts. Old Tom Davidson's voice rose above the chaos. Territory? These are our hunting grounds. Been that way for generations. A younger hunter, barely 20, spoke up unexpectedly. Maybe that's the problem. We've acted like we own everything, never thinking about sharing space with predators. Sharing space. Mike laughed bitterly. With an apex predator? This isn't some fairy tale where wild animals become friends. This is real life, and in real life, predators kill. The mayor banged his gavel for order. We've got petition signatures from both sides. The hunters want authorization for a removal operation. The conservation group wants protected status for the area. We need to find middle ground. There is no middle ground with a tiger, someone shouted from the back. Jake pulled out his phone, connecting it to the projector. Images filled the screen. Blaze moving through his territory, careful documentation of his hunting patterns. All prey animals, no livestock or pets. The final image showed the tiger watching over a family of deer, making no move to attack. He's maintaining the ecosystem, Jake explained. Controlling prey populations, keeping other predators in check. Remove him, and we'll see an explosion in deer numbers. More vehicle collisions, crop damage. A clash near the door interrupted him. Two hunters had grabbed a young conservationist who'd been filming the meeting. No recordings, one growled, reaching for the camera. Jake moved to intervene, but Marcus Cooper got there first. Back off, Marcus warned the hunters. This isn't how we handle things. The tension in the room was a living thing, ready to ignite. Mayor Thompson called for a brief recess, but the damage was done. Outside the community center, groups formed, voices raised in anger and fear. You're putting everyone at risk, Mike confronted Jake in the parking lot. All for some misguided loyalty to an animal that saved you once. What happens when it changes its mind? That's what you don't understand, Jake replied quietly. It wasn't a one-time thing. Blaze has shown consistent behavior. He's intelligent, aware. He's a killer. Aren't we all? Jake's questions silenced the group. Every hunter Ria's taken life. The difference is Blaze kills only what he needs to survive. Can we say the same? The confrontation might have escalated further if Sarah hadn't arrived with breaking news. We got a problem, she announced, showing Jake her tablet. Someone set up illegal traps in Blaze's territory. Military-grade stuff, not just hunting equipment. The revelation shifted the atmosphere. Even Mike looked troubled. Military-grade? That's not hunting. That's execution. Jake felt a cold knot in his stomach. This isn't about protection anymore. Someone's trying to force our hand. The meeting resumed with new urgency. The immediate threat of illegal traps united the community, however temporarily. Even those who wanted Blaze removed agreed that illegal traps posed a danger to everyone, humans and animals alike. Mayor Thompson established an emergency committee combining experienced hunters and conservationists to patrol for traps. It wasn't peace, but it was cooperation born of necessity. As the meeting dispersed, old Tom caught Jake's arm. Your daddy and I once found illegal traps up near Miller's Ridge. Nearly lost his dog to one. He'd be the first one out there looking for these, tiger or no tiger. The comment hit Jake hard. Would he? Even knowing what the tiger means to me. Tom's weathered face softened slightly. Your father was stubborn, set in his ways, but he believed in fair play. These traps? He shook his head. This ain't hunting. This is murder. The community divided that night, but not along the lines anyone expected. Those who respected the land and its laws, whether hunters or conservationists, found themselves allied against an unseen enemy who respected neither. Jake stayed late, marking maps with Sarah and Marcus, planning search patterns for the trap removal teams. The conflict had evolved beyond a simple dispute between tradition and conservation. Now it was about protecting their community, all of it, human and wild, from those who would destroy the delicate balance they were struggling to maintain. As thunder rolled outside, Jake studied the territory maps, knowing Blaze was out there somewhere. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're coming." The storm ahead would test them all. But for the first time, Jake saw hope in the way former adversaries now stood together, united by a threat to something they all held dear: the wild heart of their home. The county fairgrounds transformed over 3 days, becoming something the town had never seen before. Banners declaring coexistence is possible hung alongside traditional hunting club flags. Educational booths lined the main walkway, while a massive screen dominated the central stage, ready to showcase Jake's unprecedented footage of Blaze. "This is either going to unite the community or tear it apart completely," Sarah remarked, helping Jake adjust the audio equipment. Local news vans were already arriving, drawn by the controversy. The story of a hunter-turned-conservationist and his unlikely bond with a tiger had caught national attention. Jake checked his presentation one last time. "We've got wildlife experts from 3 states, traditional hunters willing to discuss sustainable practices, and proof that predators and humans can coexist. If this doesn't change minds, nothing will." The event began at sunrise with a traditional hunter's breakfast, Jake's deliberate nod to community heritage. Old Tom Davidson surprised everyone by attending, bringing his famous venison sausage. "Just because I don't agree with everything," he said gruffly, "doesn't mean I can't listen." By mid-morning, the grounds were packed. Families moved between booths learning about wildlife tracking, conservation methods, and sustainable hunting practices. Jake had carefully balanced the presentations, ensuring neither side felt alienated. Children gathered excitedly around a booth where Sarah demonstrated how to identify different animal tracks. The first tension arrow, when Mike Reynolds and his hunting group arrived. They moved through the crowd wearing their orange hunting vests, a silent protest against what they saw as an attack on their way of life. Jake approached them directly. "Glad you came, Mike. There's a presentation on traditional tracking methods I think you'd appreciate." Mike's response was cold. "We're here to make sure our side is heard." "This isn't just your show, Jake." "That's exactly right," Jake agreed, surprising him. "It's everyone's show. That's the whole point." The morning sessions went smoothly. Wildlife biology lectures, hunting safety courses, conservation workshops. Jake had structured the event to build toward the afternoon's main presentation. But as the crowd gathered at the central stage, he noticed unfamiliar faces in hunting gear moving through the audience. Marcus Cooper caught his arm. "We got problem. Those aren't local hunters. Someone's brought in ringers to disrupt the event." Jake nodded, having expected something like this. "Keep an eye on them, but don't engage unless necessary." The lights dimmed as Jake took the stage. The massive screen behind him lit up with his first photo of Blaze, the tiger standing majestically at forest's edge, sunrise highlighting his powerful form. "A year ago, I would have seen this sight through a rifle scope," Jake began. "Today, I see it through a camera lens." Both perspectives require skill, patience, and respect for nature. The difference is what we choose to capture. He moved through his presentation, sharing not just photos but data. Studies showing how apex predators stabilize ecosystems, statistics on reduced crop damage in areas with natural predator populations, evidence of Blaze's positive impact on local wildlife patterns. The audience was captivated, even the skeptics. Then came the video that changed everything, footage of Blaze helping an injured wolf pup. The tiger, coming across the pup trapped in mud, carefully pulled it free and guided it toward its pack's territory. "Impossible," someone shouted. "It's fake." "The footage is verified," Jake responded calmly. "We had 3 wildlife experts authenticate it. This isn't just random behavior. This is an intelligent creature making conscious choices." The planted disruptors made their move during the question session. A large man in pristine hunting gear, obviously never used, stood up. "You're destroying a way of life with these lies. This whole thing is a setup." Before Jake could respond, old Tom Davidson rose from his seat. "Son, I've hunted these woods for 50 years. and I was ready to dismiss this whole thing too. But I've watched. I've verified. This isn't about destroying our way of life. It's about making it better. The interruption backfired. Instead of creating chaos, it sparked genuine dialogue. Hunters in the audience began sharing their own observations of changing wildlife patterns. Conservation supporters acknowledged the importance of regulated hunting in wildlife management. The event reached its climax as the sun set. Jake saved his most powerful evidence for last. Thermal camera footage showing Blaze patrolling the edges of town at night, actively avoiding human contact while keeping other predators away from populated areas. We don't have to choose between human safety and wildlife preservation, Jake concluded. We can have both, but it requires something from all of us, the willingness to change how we see the world and our place in it. The standing ovation started with Sarah and the conservation group, but it spread until even Mike Reynolds and his hunters were applauding. Not enthusiastically, but with grudging respect. As people filed out, Jake overheard conversations that gave him hope. Hunters discussing camera equipment with wildlife photographers. Conservation advocates learning about traditional tracking methods. Children begging their parents to join the Junior Ranger program. The planted disruptor has tried one last time, attempting to start a fight near the parking lot. They found themselves surrounded by both hunters and conservationists, united in protecting their community's event. They left quickly, their mission failed. Late that night, as Jake helped break down the displays, Sarah brought him a local newspaper's early edition. The headline read, "Hunter's Vision Unites Divided Community." Below was a photo of old Tom Davidson shaking hands with a young conservation advocate, both smiling. "It's a start," Jake said, looking out toward the forest where he knew Blaze was watching, guardian of a wilderness that was beginning to feel less like a battlefield and more like a shared home. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "More than a start. You've shown them a new way forward. Not everyone will take it, but enough will. That's how change happens." As the last lights went out at the fairgrounds, Jake heard a distant tiger's roar, Blaze's voice carrying across the darkness. A reminder that some boundaries were meant to be crossed, some traditions meant to evolve, and some changes meant to heal rather than divide. The success of the community event had created an uneasy peace, but like the stillness before a storm, it wouldn't last. 2 weeks later, at dawn, Jake's phone exploded with messages. Someone had spotted armed men entering Blaze's territory. Not local hunters, but professionals with high-powered rifles and tactical gear. Jake was already pulling on his boots when Sarah's call came through. "They're poachers," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They've got tranquilizer guns too. Someone's hired them to take Blaze, dead or alive." The morning mist still clung to the trees as Jake parked at the forest entrance. He found Mike Reynolds already there, rifle in hand. Jake tensed, but Mike raised his hands. "I'm not with them," Mike said grimly. "This is our forest, our community. Whatever we think about that tiger, these outsiders don't get to make the call." More vehicles arrived, hunters and conservationists alike, drawn together by news of the invasion. Old Tom Davidson organized them into search parties, mixing experienced hunters with wildlife observers. "You spotters know the tiger's patterns," he told the conservation team. "We know how to track humans. Together, we might have a chance." Jake led his group toward Blaze's cave, moving silently through familiar territory. The forest felt different today. Every shadow potentially concealing a threat, every snapped twig a warning. Through his binoculars, he spotted boot prints that didn't belong to any local hunter. Tactical treads, military grade. "They're professionals," Marcus whispered, examining the tracks. 3 teams, moving in a standard search pattern. "They know what they're doing." A shot cracked through the morning air, followed by shouts. Jake's heart lurched as he recognized the location. Near the stream where he often photographed Blaze. His radio crackled with Sarah's voice from another search party. "Movement near Sector 4. It's Blaze. He's leading them away from his territory." Jake's group converged with others, moving quickly but cautiously through the underbrush. They could hear the poachers ahead, their voices carrying clearly. Not locals, their accents marking them as outsiders. Through the trees, Jake caught glimpses of their tactical gear and sophisticated weapons. "Target spotted," one of them shouted. Moving northeast, Jake's radio came alive with old Tom's voice. They're herding him toward the ravine. It's a trap. The realization hit Jake hard. The same ravine where he'd fallen, where this had all begun. The poachers were using standard big game tactics. Drive the target into a natural barrier, then close in for the kill. Without thinking, Jake broke from the group, taking a route he knew would intercept Blaze's path. He heard Marcus calling after him, but didn't stop. The forest blurred around him as he ran, branches ipping at his face. He had to reach Blaze first. He burst into a clearing just as Blaze appeared on the other side. The tiger's eyes locked onto him immediately. Behind Blaze, Jake could hear the poachers approaching. The tiger's muscles were tensed, ready to spring, but he held his ground, watching Jake. "Trust me," Jake whispered, knowing Blaze could hear him. "One more time, old friend. Trust me." The poachers emerged from the trees, rifles raised. Target acquired. One barked into a radio. "Clear shot in 3, 2, stop." The command came from multiple voices as local hunters and conservationists emerged from the forest surrounding the clearing. Mike Reynolds stood with his rifle trained on the poachers. Sarah's group appeared on the other side, cameras recording everything. The lead poacher kept his rifle aimed at Blaze. "We have a contract. This animal is a threat that needs to be eliminated." "The only threat I see," old Tom's voice rang out, "is a bunch of outsiders trespassing on our land, threatening our wildlife." The standoff stretched for endless seconds. Blaze remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Jake. The trust in that gaze, the intelligence and understanding was unmistakable to everyone in the clearing. "You want to know about threats?" Jake stepped forward, placing himself between the rifles and Blaze. "This tiger has had 1,000 chances to harm humans. Instead, he saved my life. He's protected our forest from other predators. He's shown more humanity than the people who hired you." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "Every second of this is being live-streamed. The whole country is watching. Make your choice." The poacher's leader hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon. "Contract's not worth this much heat." He gestured to his team to withdraw. As they backed away, Blaze did something extraordinary. He walked forward, past Jake, and stood at the edge of the clearing. The message was clear. This was his territory, and he was allowing them to leave it. The poachers gone, the forest fell silent. Then Blaze turned to Jake and did something that made even the skeptics gasp. He dipped his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, before disappearing into the undergrowth. Mike Reynolds was the first to speak. "I've hunted for 40 years. Never seen anything like that. That wasn't just an animal. That was a guardian," old Tom finished. "Been here all along, watching over these woods better than we ever did." The confrontation changed everything. Videos of Blaze's behavior went viral. Wildlife experts descended on the town, amazed by the unprecedented interaction between human and tiger. But more importantly, it changed the community itself. The old battle lines between hunters and conservationists began to blur. They had stood together to protect something larger than their individual beliefs, the delicate balance of their shared home. As they walked back through the forest that morning, hunters and conservationists alike moved with new awareness, new respect. Jake lingered in the clearing, knowing Blaze was still watching. "Thank you," he said softly, "for teaching us all what's possible." A low rumble from the forest, not quite a roar, not quite a purr, answered him, carrying across the distance between wild and tame, between old ways and new understanding. The revelation came 3 days after the confrontation, delivered by a distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit who introduced himself as Dr. James Chun from the International Conservation Society. He requested a private meeting with Jake, Sarah, and the mayor at Town Hall. "What I'm about to tell you," Dr. Chun began, placing a thick file on the conference table, "has been classified until now. Your Blaze isn't just any tiger. He's the last known pure-blooded descendant of the Caspian tiger lineage, long thought extinct." The room fell silent. Sarah reached for the file with trembling hands, her veterinary training allowing her to understand the genetic markers Dr. Chin pointed out. "But how did he end up here?" He was part of a secret breeding program in a private reserve, Dr. Chen explained. When poachers breached the facility 2 years ago, they killed most of the tigers. Blaze escaped. We've been tracking reports of his movements ever since, but lost him until your stories started circulating. Jake sat back, stunned. That's why those poachers were so well equipped. They knew what they were hunting. Exactly. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. The black market value of the last Caspian tiger is astronomical. But what's priceless is his behavior. The way he's integrated into this ecosystem, his interaction with humans, it's unprecedented. Mayor Thompson leaned forward. What does this mean for our community? It means, Dr. Chen smiled, that your town is sitting on what could become one of the most important wildlife conservation sites in the world. If you're willing. The implications slowly sank in. This wasn't just about one tiger anymore. It was about preserving a bloodline thought lost to history, about proving that coexistence between humans and apex predators wasn't just possible, it was natural. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Old Tom Davidson was the first to offer his hunting lease for the proposed conservation area. Others followed. Even Mike Reynolds, after a long night of consideration, approached Jake with a proposal to turn his hunting guide service into a wildlife photography tour operation. Folks will pay more to shoot with cameras than rifles, he admitted, especially if they're shooting the last Caspian tiger in the world. Jake found himself standing in the forest that evening, in the clearing where everything had changed. Blaze emerged from the shadows, somehow looking more regal now that Jake knew his true identity. The tigers settled nearby, comfortable in their shared space. So your royalty, Jake mused aloud, explains a few things about your attitude. Blaze flicked an ear in response, managing to look simultaneously majestic and amused. Sarah arrived with her testing kit, something they'd never dared to try before. But Blaze, as if understanding the importance, allowed her to take a small blood sample, while Jake kept him calm with quiet words and gentle touches. The genetic test confirmed everything. Blaze wasn't just rare. He was a living link to a past everyone thought was lost forever. His DNA contained genetic markers that could help restore diversity to all tiger populations worldwide. And he had chosen this forest, this community, as his home. The town transformed rapidly. The hunting supply store expanded to include a photography section. Local guides who once tracked deer now led wildlife observation tours. Schools developed conservation programs, with students learning to monitor and protect wildlife alongside traditional outdoor skills. But the most profound change was in the town's identity itself. What had been a community divided by old conflicts became united by something larger: the responsibility of protecting a living miracle. The last Caspian tiger hadn't just survived here. He had thrived, proving that the gap between wild and tame wasn't as wide as humanity had imagined. Jake's father's old cabin became the headquarters for the new conservation center. Inside, Jake hung 2 photographs side by side. One of his father with his first hunting trophy, and one of Jake with Blaze, neither predator nor prey, but partners in an impossible friendship. Dr. Chen's final report to his society concluded with words that would later be carved onto the conservation center's entrance. In a small town where tradition once meant dominion over nature, a supposedly extinct tiger taught humanity a different way. Here, the last Caspian tiger didn't just survive, he showed us how to evolve. Blaze continued his patrols, now monitored but never contained. His territory, why became a protected sanctuary, but he remained free, wild, choosing daily to maintain the trust he'd built with the community. Other tigers would eventually be introduced to the area, carefully selected for genetic compatibility, but Blaze would always be different. The tiger who chose to change not just his own fate, but the fate of an entire community. Jake often returned to the cave where their story began. Sometimes Blaze would join him, their unlikely friendship a living testament to the possibility of change. The last Caspian tiger had done more than survive. He had shown that the future of conservation lay not in separation, but in connection. As the sun set on another day in their transformed community, Jake watched Blaze disappear into his forest. The tiger's roar echoed through the trees, no longer a sound of warning or threat, but a reminder of the wild heart that still beat in the world, and of the choices that had led them all to a future no one could have imagined. "You were never just a tiger," Jake whispered to the darkening forest. "You were a bridge between worlds." From somewhere in the gathering darkness, a low rumble answered him. The voice of the last Caspian tiger, calling humanity toward a new understanding of what it meant to be wild, to be free, and to be truly civilized.